Welcome, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're tuning in from. I'm Alex Rizzi, a Senior Director at the Center for Financial Inclusion, and I'm so delighted to moderate this global plenary today on responsible AI for inclusive finance. So I'll quickly set the stage, but then I want to jump in almost immediately to hearing from our fabulous speakers. So what is responsible AI and why is it a critical topic to discuss in inclusive finance? First, let's address the obvious hype around AI this year, that generative AI has brought the topic of AI into the public consciousness like never before. As I mentioned yesterday in the Financial Inclusion Week opening, it took 16 years for mobile phones to reach 100 million users, but ChatGPT cleared that benchmark in just over 2 months, which speaks to this week's theme around the accelerating pace of change. In inclusive finance, we've seen some interesting use cases around generative AI. We heard Leslie Go yesterday, for instance, talk about pilots in India and Indonesia that reach smallholder farmers with a generative AI chatbot in their native tongue to give them financial advice and help them navigate public benefit systems. But to be candid, I still think we're at an early stage in terms of generative AI and inclusive finance. I'm sure Financial Inclusion Week 2024 will be full of examples. But what I want to do is channel the energy that we have collectively that generative AI has kind of catalyzed to draw our attention to the ways that AI is already transforming inclusive finance and has been for quite a few years. Over 5 years ago, Bankable Frontier Associates put out a report on emerging use cases of AI and inclusive finance, examples around KYC, credit risk assessment, personal financial management, chatbots, customer services, and the use cases keep growing. AI-driven innovations are already creating viable business models for historically underserved, in part by enabling higher volumes of low-value transactions and by taking advantage of the unprecedented digital data trails that are coming from low-income consumers. Let's remember that AI is increasingly making or supporting big, high-stakes decisions for consumers. Which products or services are marketed to them and at what price, whether a loan is approved, whether an insurance claim is accepted, whether a consumer is flagged as a fraudster, or whether a small business gets access to a social protection payout, to name a few. The financial and economic consequences are huge, and the scale at which these decisions are being made really merit our careful consideration and attention. So I return again to what is responsible AI and why is it a critical subject to discuss? Mozilla Foundation has what I think is a powerful definition of responsible AI that Chennai Chair spoke about in her keynote yesterday. I'd encourage you all to take a look. She spoke about agency and accountability. First, that responsible AI must be designed with personal agency in mind, where privacy, transparency, and human well-being are centered and considered. And responsible AI must have accountability, where companies are held to account when their AI systems go awry, whether that harm is around discrimination, privacy, misinformation, or other data abuses. And I think this approach of agency and accountability are aligned with our goals as the inclusive finance community of giving agency and empowering the more than 1.4 billion who are left out of the formal financial system. And the importance of accountability is quite relevant for us, especially in the context where we work, where populations are marginalized, where they're new to digital financial services and have limited recourse options available to them. We know that this emphasis on responsible AI is needed. According to Stanford's 2023 AI Index, incidents related to the misuse of AI have increased 26 times since 2012. And frankly, I think that's an undercount, as most of the incidents in their repository were from North America or Europe. So what does responsible AI look like today in inclusive finance? How are we building it, integrating it, incentivizing it, and researching it? The speakers today are able to shed light on this from different vantage points in our ecosystem. From Mark Platchik, who works at one of the biggest fintech companies in the world, PayPal, from Dia Nguyen, who works at Amazon Web Services, which is playing an ever-growing role in the digital finance ecosystem, and who was recently named one of the top 100 people in AI by Business Insider, to Sachi Doshi of USAID, which supports dozens, if not hundreds, of projects that use AI in development and humanitarian contexts, to Laura Kyoda from the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley, who's doing cutting-edge research with fintechs on the dynamic between fairness and accuracy in AI credit scoring. So I hope we'll walk away today, after the next 56 minutes, with a deeper understanding of what responsible AI looks like currently and what some of the frontiers are in this fast-moving space. So if I could turn to the panelists now, we'd love to do just a quick lightning round of an introduction. If you could each introduce yourselves and the context in which you're working on AI and its intersection with financial services, and then answer this lightning round question of where do you see, in your opinion, does AI live up to the hype in its use cases for inclusive finance? And where is it more hype than reality? So maybe we can start with Sachi, then Laura, then Dia, then Mark. And then we can get into the weeds with each of you. So Sachi, I'll turn to you.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you for putting this very timely and thoughtful panel together. I'm excited to be in the company of these other awesome panelists, some of whom I know and some of whom I'm meeting for the first time. So hi, everybody. So I'm Sachi. I work at USAID. I lead a team here that's focused on emerging technologies. And so we've been tracking AI as one of these emerging technologies for the past 7 years or so. So well before the hype this year. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been hype around this technology from the very beginning. And I think one place that we have, so I'm not a financial inclusion specialist by any means. Our team looks at AI from this bird's eye view and its applications in development generally, and development, humanitarian assistance, the kinds of work that USAID does. And of course, economic empowerment and financial inclusion are a key objective that USAID tries to drive in the countries where we work. And I think one place where we've seen the hype cycle sort of go through its journey is in the space of lending. And I'm sure Laura has so much more to say about it. But I think what we've seen is this plethora of use cases come out of trying to include people who were traditionally left out of the formal financial system by using alternative forms of data sets, right? So if you are not a traditional candidate for getting a loan because you've never had a bank account, you have no sort of official financial history, we've seen many of these app-based companies come out that can use data from your cell phone or the way that you use your phone, call detail records, other forms of data that can be indicative of your credit worthiness. I think we're starting to see that some of them actually have done a really good job of including more people in being able to get access to credit. I was in Kenya a couple of weeks ago and met somebody who did avail of a loan in this way. And so I think it can be life-changing for people who are trying to start their own businesses or get inputs for agricultural products and services. I think where there's the other side of the coin, and I think one issue we also saw, also in Kenya, was that there's so many of these coming up now that it's for some people very easy to get loans, and there can be an issue of debt trapping or getting people into the cycle of being indebted to some of these app companies. And that's not only bad for the folks who are getting access to these loans when they don't deserve it or may not be the ideal candidate for it, but also for the companies there is a value proposition there, and it sort of undermines the value that we can be getting. So I think the technology is moving just really fast, and there's so much competition in the space that I think without safeguards and regulations, the hype can get ahead of us, and we're starting to see that, at least in some cases, in financial inclusion. I'll stop there.
Hi, everybody. I'm Laura. First of all, Alex, thanks for having us. And again, to echo Sachi, it's wonderful to be on this panel with all these panelists. I'm the Director of Research at the Institute of Business Social Impact and the Lab for Inclusive FinTech. Very candidly, the Lab for Inclusive FinTech is predicated by the notion that FinTech has moved and the innovation in FinTech space, and FinTech and AI are intrinsically moving together, especially in recent years, and outpace our ability to understand the impact of FinTech, whether they improve well-being, what is the impact of financial inclusion. We don't work just with traditionally excluded population, we also work with underserved. So think about everybody that may have a bank account but doesn't use it, again, or use it very little, or as at the margin of the value proposition of financial inclusion. In the context of the Lab for Inclusive FinTech, again, we have noticed increasingly for this population that traditionally excluded or underserved, data is becoming their collateral. Data that is originated in the context of app, data that is originated in the context of their digital business or managing the business via technology becomes actually a tool to then expand, whether it's access to credit, to insurance, but even to better management of their business. We work both with businesses, but also individuals. And for us, it was almost like a necessity, about part of the proposition of working in the fintech space, how you actually leverage and measure the impact of AI technology, but also data in ensure financial health, borrow PayPal actually label. In terms of hypes, and so I think, Alex, you mentioned these financial AI and also some of the elements of financial technology. If you go on the blockchain or other, are very much in their infancy. We really don't understand their power, and also technology tend to be neutral, how they're used, how they're leveraged, and whether they're going to hurt in terms of welfare or not. Consumer is yet to be proved. Definitely, they can actually serve as a bridge to actually expand the access to financial inclusion in many diverse, including protection element, is not all bad. The part that is, this is AI. AI is kind of intrinsically linked to data, but the question of, do we have the right data? Where are the unintended consequences of some of the decision, and where are they trade-off? And these are not theoretical questions that you and I and some of the other kind of experts on this panel can discuss, but becomes very much a case-by-case discussion based on your data, based on your objective function. So if you want to, where, I don't say AI falls short, but where we need to learn more and we need to do a little bit more research is along these dimensions, very much among where are these trade-off, and it's very much an empirical question rather than a theoretical question. The other element is clearly is access to data, it's privacy, the intersection between consent and actually use of this data. But we can come back, I know come back to this later. Alex?
Thanks, Laura. Dia?
Greetings, everyone. I'm Dia Nguyen, and for those that may not be seeing me, I'm an African-American woman with medium brown skin, short brown, golden curly hair in the style of a bit of a frohawk, and I'm wearing a Black inclusive tech t-shirt and Black leather jacket. I currently work at Amazon Web Services focused on responsible AI, and a little over 3 years ago, I started a customer-facing practice where we had a specific aim to assist our customers understand the risk and potential unintended impact from their individual use of, and I guess the use and application of AI, and help them understand as well how to mitigate those risks. I've recently expanded my focus in the last year to consider how we not only influence AI strategy with responsible AI, but also as a leadership imperative, but also look at how do we explore the ways in which responsible AI needs to be applied to developers in the trenches that are actually building AI-driven products or using AI to help them develop. And I also get the benefit of working sort of on a pan-Amazon effort that is focused on inclusive tech. So the idea that we are centered on born inclusive, designing for inclusion in the initial stages. And that's a focus on looking at it through education, processes, design, and overall implementation and use within the organization. And now that's the foundation for my work. So similar to a couple of others, I am not necessarily in the fintech space, but I've had an opportunity to engage and interact with enterprises as well as startups that are starting to explore and AI more. And certainly that's been a great, or an industry that is highly concentrated on use cases in this current season with generative AI, and one that's been using, AI for a while. So to answer your question about the hype, I think it's not necessarily hype because we know that AI has been used and employed in financial institutions for a long time. I think the question really is what more needs to be done in order to address the areas of inclusion to ensure that as we're looking at new products and building new applications, that we're actually actually doing those in ways that address some of the concerns or the areas of inequity. And that becomes a little bit more challenging, especially when we think about, one, those who are responsible for building those systems, the places where power lies and exists, and what that looks like in terms of its overall application or the way that it's proliferated into the industry. There are tons, as others mentioned, there are a number of fintech, businesses, mostly, startups that are actually looking at and employing ways in which to use AI to meet the underbanked and the unbanked, but there's still, when we still have, and depending on what you look at, 1.4, 1.6 billion that are under and unbanked, we know that we still have a long way to go.
Thanks so much, Dia. Mark?
All right, I think I'm next. So hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Alex, for having me on this fantastic panel. My name's Mark. I'm PayPal's Chief Privacy Officer. And in my function, I'm overlooking not only the privacy team, but also the data oversight team. So I have data and privacy basically under my umbrella. What can I add? So many fantastic points have already been made by this group. So I have the ungrateful task now to build on top of that. Let me try to put that a bit into perspective of how that looks at PayPal, because privacy was mentioned, data was mentioned. All of the keywords are already here. So thinking about the hypes in that context, really, I agree, like, is it really a hype? For us, not so much, because we're using AI for quite some time already. So in the KYC space, you said it already, Alex, credit space, risk, fraud, all the models that we have developed there. So these are really like tangible examples of how we're using AI already. And it's not so much of a hype and more kind of like enhancing what we have these capabilities at the moment. I agree that the hype came up when we all talked ChatGPT, right? And that opens doors that we never had seen before. So now we need to think about how we step through that, through these doors. And that's exactly why I think we're getting into this direction where AI falls a little bit short right now. There are a couple of fantastic tools out there, but everyone has to figure out for themselves how to use it. Like, it's not a one size fits all. So what happens, and mainly these are things that needs to be driven by people who have the ideas in the company, right? So I talk about the business. So in our environment as a fintech, where we have a portfolio of different financial products, the business needs to tell us how they want to use AI best, and whether it should be, in the front end, in the back end, and what the capabilities are. And then it's our task, more or less, to figure out, like, well, what are the risks? Like, what are the controls that we have to build around it? So this is really where I think it falls a little bit short, because there, with the hype came a considerable amount of ideas, what we call initiatives, and you have to size them all, right? You need to figure out, does it make sense? Is it too risky? Is it not too risky? Many things are actually, if you look into it in detail, it's not much more than Googling in a comfortable way. Let's put it that way. So you get a digestible output very much sooner than you got it before, but in the end, it's still the same. So these are the things that people have to figure out right now. And let's face it, it eats a lot of resources if you work on many, many ideas. So you really have to strike the balance there. Like, what are your priorities? What do you want to follow up with? Where do you want to look into in detail? Maybe there is even a quick application or deployment, because it's not risky at all, just internally, etc. But sometimes you do have to look into quite in detail to understand what's actually happening. So I guess these are the two areas when I think about the hype. Clearly ChatGPT, and then the downside, the falling short, is a little bit of the, oh God, there is so much coming, so let's see what we can do quickly.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Mark, and thank you for all the intros there. I can't wait to get into the weeds on many of what you laid out in your open. So maybe, Mark, I could stay with you. You talked about how PayPal has been using AI for some time already. I wonder if you could speak about some of those use cases, particularly those that you see as linked to financial inclusion, and then would love to get into how you see some of the risk, particularly with your hat as the Chief Privacy Officer.
Sure, happy to go into that in detail a bit more. So as I mentioned already, like, we're using models, so AI already in the KYC, credit risk space, AML, fraud, so anti-money laundering. So what people know about PayPal is usually the blue button somewhere on the website, and it's quite easy to, you know, click on it, and then you have paid and you get your shiny new shoes that you were waiting for so long. And that's kind of like all of the excitement because it's easy and quick. But people don't really think about what's happening in the background. And many of the things that are happening in the background is actually AI enabled or model enabled. So while you click on this link to pay, you can't imagine how many checks and controls we have in the background to make this transaction pass through easily. So there is this anti-money laundering check, there is the fraud checking, there is KYC. All of that happens in the background, and these are all very sophisticated models that we have put together in the past. Now, having said that, of course, Gen AI and ChatGPT opens you a lot of more doors than we had before, where we have to figure out how we can use it in our environment, also with which kind of data we need to use it. So as you know, like we have, like as I said, when we use this AI in the past, and you probably have heard our CEOs, we just had a change in CEO, so I still say CEOs instead of the one, but Alex Chris now is our CEO, and we talk about it like democratized financial services. And when we talk about that, that's exactly what we're doing as a team, but also with the technology in the background that we want to deploy the right way. And I'm deliberately say the right way because there's so much you have to consider. So not every idea, kind of like, let's put this control in place, is a good idea. Because now if we're moving into these conversations, which are important and needed to talk about responsible AI, that comes with the topic of ethics as well. So you need to ask yourself the question, do we really want to do that? Even though we can, no doubt, like maybe for some people it's a great idea, but for others not so much. So this ethical point of view comes in as well. So you really have to look at it from different perspectives. So privacy was always one angle that was said. There is the other angle of the ethics, as I mentioned, the underlying data you will need. Is it a off-the-shelf model that you bought somewhere and you deploy? Is it something you build yourself? What can you feed into it? What is the output? Like, do you need to brand the output as AI created? Because at some stage, eventually, we will lose overview of what we created, let's say manually with a computer, or just like prompting it into an AI machine. But in the space now, particular where we're talking about all of these checks that we have to do, because it's the law that we check against fraud, for example, like technology, AI models, that was always one of the big things we were working on, and where we are pretty proud that we have put in place pretty robust processes.
And with kind of with your privacy hat on, kind of either at PayPal or more broadly, what are some of the kind of privacy concerns that you see around some of the different use cases of AI in financial services, particularly the customer-facing ones? And maybe just on a final question, kind of where does that live in terms of what you're talking about, making sure that it's designed and deployed responsibly? Is that primarily within your team and the privacy team, or are there other teams involved that are thinking about kind of responsible AI?
Right. Well, so then let me start with the first part of the question, maybe. Look, from a privacy perspective, and let me talk privacy and data, maybe, just because that's what I do, right, where I get looped in. I mean, there are a lot of conversations at the moment where should that sit best, but I feel that so many stakeholders have to have their say in the whole process in a big company that you can't really pinpoint it somewhere like, okay, this is the privacy team or this is the data team. You really need to think about a process where everyone involved has their say and can also come up with suggestions, but also challenges, right? So what I'm seeing on the privacy front now in particular is you need to educate everyone working with AI a little bit on how do you prompt something in a model, and then also how you can, what you want to get out of this model. So basically you need to control the input and then also somehow the output, because you can't just feed everything into an AI model if you're not entirely sure what's happening in there. So we always talk about this famous black box in the middle, right? Everyone knows what they're prompting and everyone knows what they can read as an output, but no one really knows what's happening in the black box. Now, if we don't know what happens in the black box, what's left to control? Just a blunt question, right? I guess it's the input, so the prompts, and then also the output on the other side. And that's exactly why we're trying to educate people a little bit. Like, don't use personal data to prompt something in a machine. Like that's a no-go. If you have the output, let's watermark it somehow as an AI output so that we don't lose track. Let's inventorize the output, that we always know where it's coming from, and maybe over time also understand how the output relates to the prompts, right? I'm always saying, if we, again, coming to this black box, if we don't know really what's happening in there, well, let's keep under control how we're using it, because maybe that in reverse educates us again how we can use the technology to the best of its capabilities. So that's super important. And then now more on the data side, it's the same thing. Like if you if you buy or purchase a build model and then you prompt something and you get an output, that's one thing. But we will all move eventually to this direction where we want to train our models or our Gen AI ourselves. And that's where it really becomes critical again. Not only from a data perspective, because no offense to no big company or any company, but usually like the data quality in itself is already a challenge and companies are working hard on it. But you need to make sure that this data that you feed or with which you train a model is actually accurate and fit for purpose. Otherwise you get biases, you get wrong outputs, hallucination. Oh God, I'm so sorry, it's early and I'm German, I can't say that word, but I hope you know what I mean. So these are all the different things that you're seeing on the data front. And then again, from a personal data perspective, what concerns me sometimes is we will never be able to wrap our minds around transparency about the black box. Well, then let's at least make sure that we control the data use. So personal data use on both ends, not only what's going into it by prompting, but also what's coming out of it. If this is somehow has a taste of personal data. So that's super important to me. So in essence, you can use it whatever way you want to, but there needs to be some kind of like manual control occasionally around it, that you make sure that it's also fit for purpose under privacy requirements. And then lastly, real quick, if I have the time still, but how is my group involved? I'm actually super proud of my team. Like, they're doing a fantastic job. We were not asked, like, can you please lead this work, or can you please sit here, or can you please sit here and give your input? Actually, the way it came to us was fantastic ideas by the business, which run through a certain process, which we call the privacy impact assessment, and other processes we have built over time. And it came quite naturally that people reached out to us and said, like, look, we have this new idea, and somehow we realized personal data is involved, and we were prompted to fill in an assessment. Can you please help? And so it came to us, and we all sat down and then formed, of course, a responsible AI committee where I have a say and sit on the table, and different forums where we discuss the different initiatives. But it was quite interesting to see that not a law forced you into it, but rather the ideas coming in looped you, the people who had the ideas looped you into the process.
Great. Thanks so much more. There's so much that in what you already said. Would love to dig in more, but yeah, want to pivot to Dia and hear from you. Dia, you mentioned in your opening how at AWS you're increasingly working with fintechs and financial service providers as clients, and they're using your solutions for key business functions. And so I wondered if you could first talk to some of the trends you've seen in the way that financial service providers are using AWS's AI products and solutions. And then would love to hear more about how you're embedding and approaching responsible AI in that integration.
Sure. And let me just share, I when I was thinking about this, and I often reference this particular topic, and certainly Alex, from some of our work already, that this for me is pretty personal and an area of interest because of my personal interest. When I started looking at this, and we go back before the pandemic, they were talking about the numbers of adults that were unbanked as being somewhere around 2.2 billion people, right? Somewhere along there, depending on what study you look at. And even now, we're still in pretty much the same range, with some improvement perhaps from following the pandemic, but still, in some ways, still seeing a large number of underbanked or unbanked. in regions like Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, which tend to be disproportionately women and the poor. And when we look at that, like taking that from the global lens, but just to here in the US, I think the numbers equally are, pretty abysmal when we think about, folks that don't have, traditional banking services or don't have access to, the financial services in the way that they should. Both the FDIC and Federal Reserve estimate that that's somewhere around 6%, right? Which is almost 6 million people here in the US. And that typically affects both Black and Hispanic adults that have lower rates of bank ownership and account ownership in comparison to white and Asian adults. And that actually has a significant impact on, what that means for future wealth building. And I'm giving this context one, like I said, because that is one that is personal when we talk about the racial wealth gap and evidence of the disparity that also gets baked into what is our data and the foundation for the models and what ultimately, our customers or folks that are building upon these systems are using. And then there's this other sort of context to that as well that, when we talk about, and this is a lens that I bring into this conversation when I think about this as it relates to responsible AI, because it can't just be that we focus on building a system or we think about looking at how we address bias in the system. And there is no way to actually eliminate bias entirely from the data. But then we also have to think about what do we do in order to ensure that we're providing access, and access that crosses a number of different dimensions as well, and opportunity such that folks can actually have meaningful ability or opportunity around, equity, which actually equates to some of the issues that we have from a structural sort of inequity perspective when it comes to financial inclusion. So all of that is I think the foundation for one, why responsible AI needs to be thought about sort of comprehensively and broadly, and not just actually targeted to one specific or a technology solution alone, but much more comprehensive look at how we approach that. I think that we're seeing in the way of trends or use cases, I think we all can attest to the fact that technology is considered a driver of not just economic growth, but new opportunity and benefit across a number of different industries. And the use cases, I think, are aligned to how we see greater efficiency in an organization from an operational perspective. There are, use cases around what an organization, the ways in which an organization might innovate to provide new services. In particular cases, we already heard some mention of fraud and reducing fraud. I think all of those are typical of what we're seeing in the ways in which folks are thinking about how do we actually, innovate or use the technology as a competitive advantage. There are two companies that I think are, some great examples to highlight. One is TNEX, and they launched a digital bank on AWS in 2020. And they did this in what was considered, roughly about 10 months, where they were able to transfer, a core part of their infrastructure onto AWS. And in 2021, they received, the best new digital bank accolade from the International Finance magazine. They were the first virtual bank in South Africa, in South Asia, to receive the full banking license in almost 20 years. And was Vietnam's first digital native mobile bank, with the focus of, being able to provide inclusive and secure, affordable and innovative, financial solutions to, every individual. And so TNEX, in their context, was focused on removing barriers to access for the under or unbanked in that region. Ayala Credit is another one of those organizations, a financial services startup, so fintech, and they were focused on, regions in Lagos, so Africa, Accra, and Manila. And they are using some deep learning and AI in order to be able to address identity verification challenges. They were also using some machine learning driven risk assessments in order to influence or impact their B2B integrations with other employers and cooperatives that were looking to provide financial services and microloan services, but also to determine eligibility for applicants for loans. I think both of those financial institutions are, ones that were, using AI, using core sort of cloud technologies, which both sort of coupled together are ways in which we're seeing, organizations address questions of financial institutions. More broadly, when we think about how we, see more applications like this thrive or leverage AI in particular, in order to, provide more equitable outcomes, I think about this and have approached this with customers looking across, 7 key areas in order to make that real. One is around value alignment, and this is the question of, and Mark was just, mentioning this, or I think somebody mentioned this at the beginning, just in terms of like, is this really the right problem to solve with AI? We should be thinking about this as a tool, a technology, and enabler, but not necessarily the end all or be all for every particular use case. And so value alignment as well is to consider whether or not we're looking at and paying attention to what is socially acceptable or what other sort of regulatory considerations and norms that are reflective in the specific region, because what is acceptable here in the US may not be, in another. And so taking all of that into consideration, the mission, vision, value, norms, right, that has to be part of this sort of value alignment consideration. The other is around inclusion. And inclusion for me is important because of some of the things that we're talking about, but this is making sure that we are bringing in the voice and perspective of those from different genders, ethnicities, national origin, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, right? That voice and perspective needs to be brought in. And it was mentioned yesterday in one of the talks as well, right? Like the consideration of building a financial application in a region and not thinking about how women might have to preserve and protect and be secure in their use because of, norms in their particular region, right? Paying attention to that matters. And so bringing in that voice and perspective, and we're not always able to make sure that we can have all of that diversity at the table, but then using techniques and approaches to make sure that we're bringing in those voice and perspective into the design and throughout, I think is critical. Education and training is essential because, again, this is not a technology solution alone. And so we should be thinking about how do we equip not just our technical resources, but everyone. And I know Mark mentioned this as well, like having broad educational programs that are or providing context to the business about how AI is being used and what they should be thinking about, because everyone in the overall product lifecycle has a part to play in ensuring that we're building an inclusive, responsible way. And so those are like 3 kind of top of mind or key focal areas. But I think just to mention quickly the others, and we heard this and you referenced this as well from Chennai Chair's conversation yesterday as well about around accountability and that being core, not just ensuring that we have sort of human agency, but also thinking about, depending on the use case, what does that mean? And certainly in the case of financial applications, there is probably more implication and necessity for us to ensure that we have the right sort of human involvement and review where necessary. And then the others are privacy and security. Mark has already kind of touched on those, so I won't dig into that deeply. What we do from a technical perspective to ensure fairness across different demographics and the transparency and explainability are others. But I think that gives us a right framework to be able to unpack where there are potential areas of risk and then actually help walk an organization through how we then, build in a way to address those and provide, value, not just to the business in the way of making money, but value to the consumer.
Amazing. Again, just so much to unpack, and I wish we had 2 hours for this discussion. But it's amazing to hear how, as a vendor and a key kind of solution provider to these fintechs and DFS providers, you're thinking about how to integrate these solutions in a responsible way. And I'm sure those use cases of TNEX and what was the other one?
Yellow credit.
A yellow credit, yeah, it'd be super interesting to explore more. Just given the time, I want to turn to Sachi. From your perspective, where you sit at USAID, as I mentioned, and as you mentioned, you're supporting so many different development and humanitarian interventions, many of which use AI. And so we'd love to hear from your vantage point. How are you embedding, how are you thinking about supporting interventions that use AI, how to do that responsibly? And are there, is there consensus in some areas in terms of what you'd like to see your partners and collaborators do? And on the same time, are there areas where you still think there's a lot to learn, where there isn't consensus?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And so much to dig into, like you said, from the previous two speakers already. And I'm going to try not to repeat the things that have already been said. But yes, I think, so at USAID, we're a development donor agency. And so most of our work is focused in developing countries. So when we think about responsible AI, we are looking at it from the lens of some of the things, Dia, you were referring to. There's global inequality. There's, at that scale. There are sort of everyone's intersectional identities, right, that fall into it. So we need to consider all of that when we're thinking about how AI is impacting the world and how it's pretty lopsided, right? So let's just face that fact. The types of benefits we see in the developed world are just not as equally accessible to many folks in the developing world. And again, that's a broad generalization, but then within that, there are different groups that experience these technologies in different ways. And so we are very mindful of that when we think about responsible AI here at USAID. And we're guided by an action plan that we put out last year it's called the AI Action Plan, that is really focused on how we can be, as a development body and others who are working in development, be more mindful of these considerations as we engage with this technology. Right? It's got tremendous potential, but it's got lots of different risks it brings with it too. And so, there are three main actions in this action plan. That's how we define our approach to responsible AI. The first one is that we need to commit to responsible AI in our work. So when we are thinking about using AI to address food security, to address financial inclusion, to address global health-related challenges and health access, we need to think about in that project how we are not only trying to solve that problem, but also we are, thinking about building the evidence base. Because like you said, many of these good practices are not, well established. And so, how are we thinking about the research questions that need to go in to understand AI's impact across a variety of contexts, building communities of practice, connecting people. That's a big role that we can play as a convener, and allowing ideas to be able to exchange, and really investing in AI workforce development in our own organizations. We need more expertise at the end. This is not just something that technologists can do alone. This is a very interdisciplinary space. And we need to have our subject matter experts understand how AI works, just as we need our AI technologists to understand how different, application areas might be working. And so I think there's all of these different things we need to do. We need to upskill. We need to get a better understanding of the implications of AI. The second thing we need to do is, in the countries where we work, whether or not we're using AI in a particular project or not, we need to be strengthening the digital ecosystems of those countries in order to support responsible AI there. And that could mean, everything from the data infrastructure, right? What are the data sets that are not available from that particular context that make AI work in this lopsided way? How do we unlock those data sets? How do we think about data governance so that we're thinking about privacy and cybersecurity? Even as we're trying to make these data sets available, where we're thinking about consent with the relevant communities about the ways in which the data is being used. I love the privacy impact assessment example that Mark gave. Those are the kinds of things that we need to sort of institutionalize with our government counterparts, our private sector counterparts. What are systems of AI accountability and oversight? How do we make sure that people understand the ways in which AI is being used with their information, and how do we, again, going back to the capacity piece, build a global AI workforce? How do we create a workforce where we're getting the points of view of different parts of the world, of different people speak different languages and have different lived experiences to participate in the dialogue around AI and build these tools and services? And so I think, and then finally, I know we're short on time. So the third big thing is like, we need to think about how we can partner to build a responsible AI agenda that is global, because we understand that, none of us can do this alone. And so, I mean, I'm just so heartened to hear, Mark and Dia's remarks and see how some of these private sector companies are really leading the way in telling us how responsible AI can function in practice. And so we need to partner with other donors, we need to partner with private sector companies, and really create a multi-stakeholder process of engaging in promoting what responsible AI is and what these best practices are. And you asked about, whether there's consensus. Some places, yes, we're starting to see that. I think there's still a lot of evidence building that needs to happen when we're talking about the global scale of these technologies. But I'd just like to point out a project that that we've done at USAID called the Equitable AI Challenge, and both Alex and Laura are a part of it. So I'm really proud to be here with both of you. But both of these projects that you guys are working on are starting to address some of these issues of consensus. So for example, we can target key stakeholders in the AI ecosystem, right? Like impact investors. And so Alex's team has been leading this project where we try to work upstream of the tool development of the places where funding is coming from for small startups, for example, and create awareness in impact investors to understand that these fintech tools and services that they are investing in might involve AI and might lead to differential outputs across gender, for example. And so how do we create due diligence tools that can really make this process holistically from the very beginning, be thinking about things like fairness and inclusion, and not further down the line, right? Like have that sort of top-down approach. And Laura's work is looking at how we can, again, it's in the looking at gender inclusion, how we can look at not treat all data sets as a homogeneous group, right? And understand that that women's data, when it comes to their financial behavior, is very different from men's data. And if we're building an algorithm to predict something about how women might engage with the economy, it might look very different from men's data and from the men's experience. And so it sounds simple, but these are the kinds of things that we need to create more evidence about, so that we can create best practices when it comes to how AI is impacting different people in different places. I'll stop there because I know we are short on time, but I'm happy to pick it up if there's something that didn't make sense.
Thanks so much, Sachi. And it's just super interesting to hear how both on a project intervention level, you're thinking about responsible AI, but also at the ecosystem level in terms of things that individual projects or private sector companies can't solve themselves. But what do we need at an ecosystem level in terms of the data sets and public goods that can help advance or incentivize more responsible practices? And I think you teed up, Laura, last but not least, beautifully in terms of hearing more about your work. And you had mentioned in the beginning, Laura, in your opening remarks, sort of some of the narrative in responsible AI around trade-offs between model fairness and model accuracy, which has business and profitability implications. And I know you're doing some really cutting-edge work with fintechs in Mexico to quantify kind of empirically, take this from a theoretical question to an empirical one as it relates to credit scoring for men and women. So would love to hear more about that, and what are some of your takeaways? How does it change how we should think about responsible AI?
Sorry. I'm going to take 15 seconds to say a little bit of the lab for inclusive fintech. We work in particular with fintech company, government, but also NGO. It is very much this kind of partnership where we build what is called field experiment, or in the industry call it A/B testing. And so we really work with them to actually design solutions, sometimes design AI models, but also kind of measure the impact of these models. In particular, in the context of Mexico, we actually working with this fintech that has access to what we call a digital footprint. And part of the origin of this problem is this notion that credit scoring, even the US, the accent is Italian. When I came to the US, I did not have any credit scoring. So even opening a bank account for somebody coming from Italy to the US was rather challenging. So now you have a two-tier system, if you want, those that have traditional and established credit history, and those instead that were for social norms that Dia was mentioned, or for kind of gender norms, or even legal norms, may not have access to these because they're migrants, they're refugees, or they're women, or other reason, they may not have an established credit history, or is very thin. So the open question, and this has been addressed in two different ways in the industry, is how you build that credit history. There is a camp that kind of subsidize credits and kind of build that data through traditional credit history. The new push has been in recent years, for instance, was using the telecom record for mobile phone. Right now is digital footprint. So suppose I have access to all your data from Uber Eats, DoorDash, Amazon, and a bunch of other kind of services, that becomes your digital footprint. You may not have a credit history, but I know whether you pay by cash, or you get a manicure, where you buy avocados with, baby formula, or with instead a beer. So can you leverage these data to actually build credit scoring models that are just as accurate as those with traditional credit history? So the first answer to this question in our case was yes. The second answer to our question, and this comes from actually more traditional economics kind of literature, women seems to be better repayer. On average, again, if you look at women tend to repay on time, there seems to be fault less, but we still pull men and women together. And I know that this is gonna hit also tee off your next question. Traditionally, because regulation, we think that differentiating some of this decision based on protected category, whether it's race, whether it's gender, or any other dimension, is actually creating inequities. I want to take a pause here to mention something. We constantly make decisions. Existing systems make this decision based on some of these protected categories. Women may not be aware, loan origination in the US looks at your zip code. Zip code is tightly related to redlining. So while race is not, oh, I don't make this decision based on race, there are a bunch of proxy in our current data and how we make decisions that actually take into consideration this protected category. So our project very much starts from the notion of like, and this is where actually the consensus, and sorry for going on nerdy on this is from the data science econometrics space. In machine learning AI, if you are concerned that some of the protected categories may be not properly represented, or your data is biased against those, one of the simplest way to do this is actually by splitting the model, by creating two different models along these lines. Why? Because then you compare the models that pulls the category together versus the one that differentiate it, and you have different prediction, different allocation, then you can kind of try to tease out and assess whether there is bias in your data and there is fairness. In our specific case, the open question was, one, are these digital footprint able to establish credit history? The answer is yes. Again, we are not the first, but there is this new dimension. So if we actually differentiate, if we create two different models that differentiate along gender, do we have different credit allocation? And do we see credit expanded to women or credit reduced to women? So you can totally see that, in this case, women would be kind of even further reduce access to credit. This is where there is a trade-off. Again, I maybe a preference to expand access to credit for women, but the predictor, the default, or the kind of the profitability model doesn't bring me there. In our case, we don't see this trade-off, for instance. We see actually that we're able to preserve the risk portfolio, if you want, of this company without expanding, and actually expanding access to credit for women. So this is one of these situations, and I know it's very rare in economics, where we have a win-win, where actually better allocation of credits lead to expansion of efficiency. Where there is some anxiety around these models, and I want to actually a little dispel. Unfortunately, you cannot take the professor out of me, but this is how I teach when I teach these elements to my master students, my students in general. We always make decisions. Decisions are made at the bail decision, at the foster decision, at the judicial trial, the loan officer. And these decisions, if pre-AI, were made by, if you want to, individuals. Those are black box decisions. I think AI very often get labeled. It's a black box decision. We don't know how that decision is made. And I agree up to a certain point, because human decisions are by default also black box decisions. There are a bunch of literature, sorry for nerding out on this, that shows that, for instance, if your football or soccer, depends on which side of the continent you are, loses, your judicial decisions tend to be harsher, or foster care decisions get affected. That's a black box. I don't want my pretrial detention or bail decision or sentencing being affected by whether the judge is angry or angry in the case of a football soccer match, or if just a very hot day in court. And so what is the kind of, if you want, the benefit of AI? They can also be black box, can also add some of these biases. But if you work with developer data scientists or nerdy like me that kind of care about statistics, you can actually set in place way to detect these biases. It's not costless. There is some additional machinery. That means these become kind of not set in place AI, but you constantly need to check the data. I think Mark was very polite. The way we data scientists call this garbage in, garbage out. Your model is going to be just as good as your data. And so there are ways you can improve even this black box decision and kind of quantify this trade-off, including between privacy and prediction. Again, I think Mark was aiding a little bit on privacy as well. The value of my data is valuable because I can make a prediction when aggregated with a bunch of other data points that is precise, that is valuable, and it kind of reduces the trade-off. If you mask the privacy, then there is the issue of how much you're willing to lose in terms of the accuracy. So there are many dimensions of, if you want to trade off, but also I remain awful. And this is, I go back to what I mentioned before, this becomes awful very often an empirical question. There are applications like mine with actually there is no trade-off, there is a win-win, but there may be other applications as a function of the existing data or lack of data where that trade-off may be more prominent. I'm going to close with something very quickly that just look at how you build actually digital footprint. Sachi was mentioning this. I have footprint for people that have footprint, and they do allow me to expand access to credit for people that don't have credit history. But there is also the open question of how do you organically build this digital footprint? Maybe I don't have enough transaction. There is that person that doesn't even access to that digital footprint at all. We also working on kind of building manipulation proof credit scoring algorithm that really allow us to just incentivize the build of the digital footprint without deprecating the prediction. And I know that we are at time.
Thanks, Laura. And so fascinating, and can't wait to see the final results of that. And I'm also going to start tracking soccer match scores, I think, more closely. We only have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to just do one final round, and I think we'll close. I have a lightning round question for everyone. One voice we didn't have in the room today was the voice of the consumer, and we think about them all the time. So I wonder if everyone could just give a 30-second to 1 minute answer. What do you think, consumers, especially in our context in inclusive finance, what do you think they deserve to know when an AI system is making a consequential decision for them in financial services? How much information about the model, the outcomes, the inputs, and if you could answer, solve that in 30 seconds to a minute, would love to hear it. And I unfortunately won't have time for questions. So Dia, do you want to start? And then maybe Dia, Laura, Sachi, and Mark.
Yeah, no, I think the thing that I was joking about was I think all of those things, right? And I know that that's probably a little less intuitive for some financial institutions, but having that visibility, right? What they're using as input, the way in which they're making decisions, when those decisions occur, all of that I think is useful for consumers. And there is some potential legislation that is moving in that direction, right, to require that.
Thank you.
And on my side, its disclosure is very much, it is not informed consent, and this is not just an AI issue, but how your data is used has become a predominantly, I think, a core issue of where we are right now. And in particular, in the context of AI, where is my data used as an input for what? And so this is where I go back a little bit to the last point. However, that's me disclosing that my data in particular, that I bought something or something else, does it alter that prediction and the value of that prediction that deprecated? Again, it's not a problem. We know how to solve the problem. We know kind of potentially we can solve that problem. But it's not as easy as to tell people exactly we use the data for this, and there is not a kind of reaction that is strategic on the consumer side. But in general, disclosure how your data is used, what it's used for, I think it's a good recommendation. And it's a must. I don't remember what's next.
Sachi, and then Mark have the last word.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll be a little bit cheeky and just say I would want to know that AI is being used at all, like first and foremost, to make any decision about me. I feel like even just that is not, we're not quite there yet, where I don't know often when AI is being used to make a decision about me, whether it's in financial inclusion or elsewhere. And I think it's just become so embedded in the work that in most of our digital interactions that I think it's important that we even step back and say that, you know, there is a machine learning algorithm behind this, not a human, and start there.
Thanks, Sachi. Mark, last word.
I'll make this very quick because transparency and disclosure was already mentioned by all of them, and we can talk about hours what the details should be. But one very important point for me is also that there is a human in the background helping out if the decision is not the ones that someone was anticipating. So there needs to be human interaction with each AI application to make sure that everyone feels comfortable.
Got it. Well, I think it's good to end on the consumer's perspective on this topic, and we could clearly talk for many hours about this. Thank you all so much. I think some questions came in. We didn't have time to answer them. I'll hop onto Swapcard and answer them or send them to some of the panelists. Perhaps we could follow up, but thank you all so much, Laura, Sachi, Mark, and Dia. Great, multifaceted discussion. And yeah, thanks so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.